Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Mizikar, Town Manager here in Shrewsbury.
Chris McGoldrick, Director of Planning and Economic Development.
So Chris and I have the pleasure today to be in SMC's new podcast studio, and we're taking a little different approach when we talk about the upcoming special town meeting, which will occur on December 17th, 2025 at 7 p.m. It's a one-article special town meeting, and Chris and I are going to dive into the details on that as we talk today. I also want to remind everyone that the Finance Committee will be holding a public hearing on December 11th, 2025 at 6 p.m. in the Select Board's room at the Town Hall. During that time, residents, not just town meeting, but any resident would be able to come in and ask questions about this article and any impacts that it may have. And Finance Committee will likely vote on a recommendation after the conclusion of that public hearing that evening. So, Chris, it's great to be here in the studio with you.
Good to be here as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about this one article special town meeting that we have coming up. It is a zoning related article, and it seeks to consider a moratorium on two overlay districts that we have in the community. Those two districts are known as the Lakeway Overlay District and the Route 20 Overlay District. And of course, why we're here in the studio today is to have a good conversation about what this article looks to do. So let's start at the basics. So what are overlay districts?
So overlay districts are a zoning mechanism. So where you normally have one zoning district, kind of like a blanket, you can layer other zones over the top, whether it's your aquifer protection overlay zone, if you want additional conservation restrictions, you can use those. So there's a lot of tools to be used with those overlay districts, but on the face, you're just layering districts on top of each other where you want to keep the base zoning in place as well.
Okay, so let's start with the base zoning. So we have Route 9 and Route 20 basically bisect the town east to west. You know, both of them run, basically from Worcester to Northborough, Westborough side of the community. The Lakeway overlay, I know, doesn't extend very far, maybe a third of the total distance of Route 9, basically from the Worcester line to Oak Street.
Correct, yep.
So what does the Lakeway Overlay District provide for someone who wants to use it?
Yeah, so the Lakeway Overlay District provides some flexibility in uses. It expands what uses can be considered under there. Under that zoning, but it also provides additional design criteria that are more expansive than the underlying zone. So in order to consider those different uses, which are a benefit, it also comes at, the developer would have to look at more expansive design criteria, whether it's the layout of the lots, additional buffering around the lots. So there's a lot of kind of detail in that, but really kind of provides more modernized design criteria.
When it comes to use, though, I know the underlying district, there for both the zoning that's along Route 20 and Route 9 is basically some type of commercial or business use. What's different in the overlay district for Lakeway?
Yeah, so the Lakeway overlay primarily expands it where you can do mixed use zoning. And some additional kind of commercial uses are also included in that. So again, it provides those additional uses. You can also use any of the existing underlying zoning uses to be considered in that mixture.
Okay. So Route 20, the Route 20 overlay district, I'm pretty sure runs nearly the entire length of Route 20, except for probably the first 10% if you're coming in from Worcester and heading east. So what are the different uses or any specific differences between or that's provided through the overlay district?
Yeah, so the underlying district in the Route 20 overlay is commercial business primarily. It provides for a number of commercial uses and some light industrial uses as well. Using the Route 20 overlay, you get expanded uses into, again, mixed use zoning, which allows for residential and commercial together on a single lot, as well as additional commercial and industrial uses that are expanded with that overlay zone.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about the background of the overlay districts. They were both put in place in the early 2000s, so nearly 20 years ago. What do you know about why they were put in place at the time?
Yeah, so obviously I wasn't there at the time, but I think primarily what those overlays we're looking at are, again, both of them look at expanding the uses to provide for additional types of development and encourage commercial development to spur that along those economic corridors. But they then put in place those design elements. So looking for more modernized design, additional aesthetics, where in the underlying zoning you don't have that. The underlying zonings are primarily more auto-centric, is the term. So looking at facilitating car movements and traffic. Sometimes the overlying zone is looking at more aesthetics and more multimodal design for different types of kind of traffic infrastructure.
So how do you think the mixed use component or the residential component, since that's probably the biggest difference in the use type from the overlay to the underlying, how do you think that played into the thought of attracting commercial development?
Yeah, I think there's probably the realization, a lot of the kind of economics of mixed use are a benefit that when you have residential mixed with commercial, not only do you have built-in, customers to those businesses, but it helps from the development side, where you're carrying more reliable users with the residential for financing that carry essentially the risk of commercial vacancy. So it's being able to deliver a mixed use product is more financially viable to developers. And it comes with community benefits of locating like uses of residential with commercial so that, you can reduce some vehicle trips by having, built-in residents. Obviously, we understand people will still go out elsewhere as well, but the idea being that they may go to a restaurant or a co-located commercial business there rather than making a trip off-site as frequently.
So is it fair to say that, housing, as a sector or a use has, normally a much higher or consistent, if nothing else, return on investment? So developers could really look to that safety of a residential component to finance the more risky or more uncertain return on investment for commercial?
Correct, yeah. And we've seen, there's a huge demand for housing, not just in our community, but statewide. And I think nationwide, there's a lot of housing demand in the market. And commercial, you see that sometimes the brick and mortar is struggling, especially your mom and pop type commercial businesses. So providing that balance allows for those investment products, essentially, for a developer to put those together and create a more viable and more resilient kind of model.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit now about what's changed and why we're proposing this. So let's start with what a moratorium is in itself before we get too deep into this. So again, the article is proposing placing a moratorium upon the use the applications for or use of the overlay districts. So how long's the moratorium for? Where did we come up with this idea for a moratorium? So what's the 101 on a moratorium?
Yeah, so the moratorium, primarily what it is it looks for, it's a mechanism that the town can utilize through zoning to put a pause on using certain provisions in their zoning. So you do have to specify which provisions that you are putting that temporary pause on. You have to define a time period. In our case, we looked at 24 months. And during that time period, you also have to specify what work will be done, what planning exercises are required to be done in that time period, and why that pause is related to that work and that planning process. So in our case, we're looking at studying our mixed use provisions within those overlay zones, specifically tied to the infrastructure, traffic, water, sewer, and otherwise, and trying to develop, reviewing if there are zoning improvements or other policy improvements that need to be put in place to better serve community goals. So again, as you stated, the zones have been in place for nearly 2 decades. We had some revision about a decade ago, but again, they're it's prudent to take another look at those and to make sure that those zones are achieving contemporary goals rather than what was 20 or 10 years ago.
Right. I mean, a lot has changed in the last 20 years, and I think it is prudent to look at the zoning district and these overlays because I think they've been successful. And if you look at two major projects, the Lakeway Commons redevelopment of the former Spags site that utilized the overlay, and you look at the redevelopment of the Edgemere Drive-In where Market Basket and that residential community is, that used the overlay to some extent. So I think those are two important projects to consider. But a lot of other things has happened around or since this zoning is passed. When I think about those corridors, three things really come to mind. One, thankfully, I'm seeing a lot more standalone commercial interest, and we have a lot of examples of that. I know, Centec North is just off of Route 20, and, that project's, sat in town ownership for 20 years, and then finally, Northbridge Partners bought it, and now it's fully leased out with all commercial, pretty high-end users. You have UPS developing right off of Route 20. You have Physique Instrumentes built their building at 440 Hartford Turnpike. So you have these really solid examples. Along Route 9, you have the redevelopment of 420 Boston Turnpike where the flea market used to be. So you have these really solid examples, and we're hearing from the developers, the commercial market that we've been desiring, or the community may have been desiring for decades, is kind of finally getting here, right? There's standalone, value. There's enough value to do some standalone commercial. We've done some significant changes in the Route 20 corridor when it comes to our infrastructure and putting sewer in there. And I think that is probably the largest single change in the last 20 years that's changing what is happening with development in the community, especially in Route 20. Right now, that's, in my opinion, that's why Route 20 is on fire, because it's a lot easier to develop and you can make a greater return on your investment when you have sewer. And, when I think about looking at this to make sure it still works for the community, we're seeing continued strength in the residential market recently and probably during that whole 20-year period for the most part. And these are our two primary commercial corridors that exist within the community. So, how do we want to preserve that land or think about that land when it comes to mixed use development? Do we need to look at other parts of town for mixed use development, right? Or, and preserve this space kind of for commercial development. So, and I know, through the SDC, there's a study underway about those commercial corridors and looking at it as well.
Yep. Yeah, and we just recently had one of our community forums with that. Got a lot of great insight from that. Really excited to see kind of where that goes and where that conversation goes. The consultant will be developing action plans out of that, and then we'll be bringing that back to the community to have that further discussion. I'm really excited to kind of see the results of that. So,
one other thing that I didn't mention that I think is a big change is we talked a lot about 40B in this community, just like many communities in the last few years. We've also complied with MBTA zoning, but when I think about 40B, we're finally at a point where, at least on paper right now, the data that we have shows that we will likely achieve 10% subsidized housing inventory in the community, which is a significant accomplishment. Thankful for the strategy that we put in place in working with developers for friendly 40Bs. And yeah, there's been some 40Bs that have come to town, 104 Main Street right now, that's not a friendly 40B, but still looking at that housing development, we will achieve that 10% subsidized housing inventory, which is the state goal. And that means that our commercial in all our zoning districts won't be subject to kind of outside vision versus the vision of the residents and the town. So we'll be able to protect our zoning district. So I think that's another good opportunity and reason for us to look at this. How do we want to control the outcomes, especially where we want to preserve and protect opportunities for commercial development? Because we know from a property tax standpoint, that's just a different return and a different formula when it comes to the revenue versus expenses that we have in servicing the community. So a lot of changes, and we're looking to pause this for 24 months, the use of these overlay districts. And Chris, you talked a little bit about what we'll do during that time. We need to look at that critical infrastructure. Do we have the water capacity and sewer capacity? Does the roadway safety stand up to high, ins and outs for residential traffic? Because that's a different traffic flow and a different traffic load than commercial development. How are we going to approach this over the 24-month period?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is that we have lined up a number of studies that will be happening. So our master plan update, first and foremost, is that the RKG study, the townwide economic plan, is another one that's very much related to this. So I don't think that the concerns that have been brought forward are necessarily anything new. I think we've been setting up a stage to respond to that. But a lot of those kind of planning practices, that we'll have a number of different studies lined up, but taking that data and putting it all together into one kind of cohesive discussion with the community, I think is going to be the biggest part of this. I think it's going to be a lot of community engagement around what are these development processes and planning processes that we have and related to zoning. And as I said at the last planning board meeting, I don't really want to put too many bumpers on that. Like, I think we can go broadly into policy to see how are we dealing with mixed use. But it's really going to be collecting that data that we have and project-based as well. Each of these projects does traffic studies. They do a lot of kind of infrastructure studies. So collecting all of that, putting it together and having a conversation with the community. And then from that, developing those action items and policy items and an idea of how do we react to that, and what are the things that are working that we want to build upon, what are things that maybe are not working that we want to improve upon, and really setting that stage that way. So
yeah, so I mean, we can't draw conclusions. We don't know what's going to happen at town meeting, and if we have that opportunity to go through the study process, we also don't know what the outcomes of that may be. Would it be tweaking the mixed use components? Would it be leaving the mixed use components in place as is? Would it be lead us in a different direction? But I think it's really important that we always take a step back and give ourselves the opportunity to study. I think it's important in this circumstance to put a moratorium in place because of the pace of applications and the interest that we have in residential development and mixed use development within these corridors and using these overlays. And I think if we didn't pause it during that time, it might, actually drive more applications and more development that would get beyond what the goals of the community are. So I do hope the town meeting members and all residents take the opportunity to come out and learn more at the public hearing this Thursday on December 11th at the Finance Committee. And then town meeting members participate on December 17th at this special town meeting. Again, just one article considering a zoning moratorium for these two overlay districts within the community. So, Chris, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, that covers it. Really excited to see where this goes, and really excited to work with the community as we move forward. So
great. Well, thanks for all that you do on behalf of the town, and we appreciate everyone taking the opportunity to listen to this, and we'll see you at the Finance Committee public hearing and a special town meeting on December 17th. Thank you and have a nice day.